Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here to the first of our 2 lectures in the Lynn Great Speaker Series. The Lynn Great Speaker Series is presented to the public as a community service, applying the Catholic intellectual tradition to issues facing the world today. The lectures are made possible by an endowment established in memory of Shu Ji Lin by his widow, Miss Cheng Li Chao Lin, and their son, Vincent Lin, a St. Mary's alum and former faculty member. This fall, the lectures are focusing on human flourishing. We seem to be in a time of stress and anxiety. Politics are divisive. Social media makes us compare and despair, feeling like everyone else is doing better than we are. We worry about safety of our families and communities now. Because of heat and flooding, we even worry about our future. Today is also the 23rd anniversary of September 11th. It was a day of shock and sorrow, a day that caused fear and uncertainty in the United States. Yet we should not forget that that day also saw so many people, especially the first responders, risk their lives to save as many people as possible. Thus, in the midst of struggles, we should remember people who want to live well. We want to be happy. We want our friends and family to be happy, fulfilled. And these lectures are meant to explore how we can flourish while facing challenges and difficulties. Tonight, we'll hear from Dr. John Malesic on work and burnout. But before I introduce our speaker and the topic, I would like to ask Father John Thompson, Marianist priest and Vice President for Mission at St. Mary's University, to give us an opening prayer.
Oremos. O God, in your wisdom, you knew that we needed time to rest, and so you gifted us with the Sabbath. Nuestros mentes y cuerpos necesitan descansar de vez en cuando. Our rest gives you glory, because you rested on the last day of creation to see that all was good. When we are rested, life is good, life is better, we are better. Tonight, as we listen to ways in which we can address burnout, let us always know that we can and must turn to your example of creation. Hay un tiempo para trabajar y un tiempo para descansar. We ask that you bless all of us here tonight. Some of us may be feeling overwhelmed, overworked, overlooked. May our focus tonight be on healing and restoration so that we can enjoy creation and one another. Bless our speaker with wisdom and insight and the ability to share words that will help build us up and bring us to a place of restoration. May our time tonight together ease our burdens and make life a little lighter. We thank you, O God, for all that you do for us, por tu sabiduría, tu presencia en nuestras vidas, y por esta comunidad de fe. Bless all gathered here today, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
We work and we work and we work and we don't get ahead. And we work and we work, and it can take over our lives. And this is what happened to John Malesic, and so he quit his job and sought a better way to live. So drawing on his book, The End of Burnout, if you like the talk, there will be copies of this available afterwards. I encourage you to buy it. The End of Burnout, Why Work Drains Us and How to Build Better Lives. Dr. Malesic will discuss burnout as the go-to term for describing our dissatisfaction with work. To break out of our obsession with work, we need to rethink our assumptions about the relationship between work and the good life. We should ground our working lives in human dignity, compassion for workers, and greater emphasis on leisure. And tonight, Dr. Malesic will show us these ideals are rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition and manifested in various religious communities. Dr. Malesic is a writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Chronicle of Higher Education, America, Commonweal, Notre Dame Magazine, The Guardian, The Hedgehog Review, and other places. His writing has been recognized as notable in the Best American Essays 4 times and in the Best American Food Writing. If you have questions about that, save that to the end. His latest book was selected as the best book of 2022 by Amazon and the Next Big Ideas Club, and is being translated into 10 languages. He holds a PhD in religious studies from the University of Virginia and teaches writing at Southern Methodist University. Please welcome Dr. John Malesic.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that wonderful introduction. Father John, for the invocation. To all of you for being here. To the maintenance and tech and catering staff who made all this possible. I must thank Mickey, who is responsible for everything good that happens this evening, to Scott, and particularly to Vincent and Sherry Lynn for endowing this lecture series, and without which, of course, I would not be here at all. So, as Jason mentioned, burnout it's kind of a buzzword. It's become, and particularly during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, it has become the go-to term for talking about our negative experience with work. Whatever problems we have with work, we label that burnout. And if you pay attention to headlines about burnout, you'll encounter a lot of alarming and often conflicting studies that in some cases, about the prevalence of burnout, that in some cases stretch the bounds of credibility. Additionally, the term has expanded to areas well beyond work. So it's a term that originated and is mostly talking about our negative experience with work, but it has been applied to, dating app burnout. I've seen articles on house hunting burnout, and my personal favorite, Burning Man burnout. So it would seem that everyone is burned out, but no one knows what that means, or that no one can agree on what exactly that means. So let's start from a better definition that we can agree on. Most broadly, burnout is the experience of being stretched across the gap between your ideals for work and the reality of your job. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by ideals? Well, ideals are the things that you expect from work, the things that you hope to attain from your work. They can be both material and immaterial. So part of those ideals and expectations include salary and benefits, paid time off, things like that. But in addition, we often expect other things from our immaterial goods from our work. We expect community. We expect sometimes fun. We expect fulfillment. We expect to express the ideals of service, of self-expression, of creativity. These are all things that you feel you have been promised, whether by society or by your employer. So a contract is a kind of statement of promises. But in addition, there are the implicit promises that our society makes, those things like fulfillment and service and so on. So those are your ideals. And then, of course, you have the reality of your job, the material reality as well as the immaterial reality. You're promised community, well, are you getting community? You're promised fun, are you getting fun? You're promised an opportunity to serve your community, are you actually receiving that? When there's a gap between ideal and reality over a long enough period of time, you try to hold those things together, but you stretch out and you undergo what we call burnout. Now, the metaphor that we have for talking about burnout is obviously burning. The metaphor that's embedded in the term is one of something like a tank of fuel that you have inside of you, that you burn through and once it's all gone, if you keep trying to continue to work, you're burned out and you're no good anymore. I think that that's not an accurate metaphor. We're probably stuck with it. But the real experience of burnout is more like stretching. It's more like being pulled between ideal and reality. Importantly, burnout is a chronic condition. You cannot be burned out for a week. At the end of a big project, you probably are not burned out. If you can rest and feel better, then you weren't burned out. If you rest and you don't feel better, if you're every bit as exhausted after adequate rest, that I think is a good sign of burnout. I think of this experience as kind of like trying to walk on a pair of stilts, where one of those stilts is your ideals for work. The other is the reality of your job. If they're well aligned, then in principle, you can move forward. But they don't have to get too far out of alignment for you to begin to wobble and start to stretch to try to hold them together and perhaps ultimately fall, as Napoleon is in this political cartoon from 1814. He can't hold together his ambitions, basically, is the story there. And if we can't hold together our ideals and reality, we are susceptible to burnout. All right, so that's a broad definition. A narrower definition of burnout comes from research, from primarily in the field of social psychology. There, researchers measure burnout along 3 dimensions. And I should say, they're measuring burnout for research purposes. This is not a clinical definition. Burnout has no clinical status in the United States. You can't be diagnosed with burnout. It's not listed as a disorder in the DSM-5. But it has a research definition, and the researchers study it along these 3 dimensions. The first, and the one that we're perhaps most familiar with, is exhaustion, sometimes called emotional exhaustion. And that is, that feeling of depletion, that feeling of chronic tiredness that often doesn't go away with adequate rest. Often burnout is just equated with exhaustion, not only in the popular conversation, but also in research. Researchers themselves don't always agree on the definition, or at least the way that they operationalize it in their studies. So there are 2 other important dimensions to burnout. The second of these is called cynicism, or sometimes called depersonalization. What depersonalization is, or cynicism, it's when you treat the people you work with as less than the full human beings that they are. So that can include your coworkers, your clients, your customers, your students, your patients, your passengers, and so on. So it's when you become, you put that distance between them. You belittle them. You think of your students as problems. You think of your patients as problems. They're the ones who are getting in the way. Like, this job would be great if it weren't for all the patients or the students or the customers or something. Well, that's who your work is supposed to be serving. That's cynicism. And just to give you an example of what cynicism sounds like, in doing some of my reporting for the book, I spoke to a social worker in Dallas named Liz. Liz was a wonderful person to speak to. She was unbelievably self-aware. And Liz talked about her experience of burnout. She said, at my last job, I got so burned out, I was put on leave of absence. I was lashing out at meetings. I was prickly, very pugnacious, ready at every turn to pick a fight. It was over dumb stuff that I didn't even care about. But I was mad, and I wanted everyone else to be as mad and as frustrated as I was. This is a classic case of cynicism. Liz was mad and she made everybody else around her miserable and she wanted to make them angry. She also said that her cynicism manifested as gossip. She gossiped about her coworkers. That's another example of cynicism I think we might not necessarily think of too often. The third dimension is a sense of ineffectiveness. Now, when you ask someone, how are you doing? How's your job going? We will very often say, oh my gosh, I'm so exhausted. Occasionally, people will even brag about how cynical they are. Think about a show like House, where this incredibly cynical physician is held up as, he's amazing at what he does, but he's so cynical. Or the hard-boiled police detective who's cynical but can solve the crime. No one brags about being ineffective. No one's, how are things going at work? I am totally incompetent. I can't get anything done. You never hear that. But it's essential. It's essential to the experience of burnout. And I think the fact that we don't brag about ineffectiveness, but we do brag about exhaustion says something about what I call our burnout culture. But yeah, ineffectiveness is this feeling that your work doesn't accomplish very much. This feeling that you are laboring and not getting any results. The feeling could be independent of actually, you might actually be more effective than you think, but the feeling of ineffectiveness is that third dimension. So these three dimensions, researchers use a questionnaire called the Malesic Burnout Inventory to measure burnout. It's named after Christina Malesic, a social psychologist at the University of California at Berkeley, who is sort of the godmother of burnout research. She's as an aside, she's a very interesting figure. You may have heard of the Stanford prison experiment. Christina Malesic halted it as a PhD student. So she's has had a huge impact over the course of a long career. But yeah, a sample question in the Malesic Burnout Inventory to measure depersonalization is something like this. So you're asked to say how frequently statements like this apply to you. And one of them would be, being in direct contact with people at work is too stressful. If you say that's every day, then you're going to score high, possibly, on cynicism. Okay, and the problem with all of this is if you are chronically exhausted, you have no energy, you are miserable to the people around you, and you feel like your work isn't accomplishing anything, you're not going to be a good worker. You're not going to be happy, but you're not going to be good at what you do. Liz said it so well. As a social worker, we're no good for the community if we're burned out. So she's in a career where burnout is a huge risk because you're working with the community, often with people who are facing real challenges. You're trying to navigate government bureaucracy and all of that. It feels ineffective. If you become cynical toward the people you're trying to help, you're not going to be able to help them. If you become cynical toward your students, your clients, your patients, you're not going to be able to help them in the way that you set out to. So this is why burnout is a problem. All right, so that's the individual side of burnout. But I think that we also can say that we live in a burnout culture, which is to say that we can think of the gap we can think about it in larger scales. We can think of the gap in terms of what our society promises workers and what their employers and the culture actually delivers. And there are three big things that our work ethic in North American societies, and really, around the world, really, there are three main elements of the work ethic's promise. So promise is three big things on the societal level. So the promise of the work ethic in the United States is that if you work hard, you will get, on the social level, you will get dignity. You will get moral character, you'll get spiritual purpose. Let's talk about these in turn here. What I mean by dignity is it's your right to count. in society, in the United States, if you have paid employment, if you are employed, you can hold your head up high and say, I'm working hard, I'm putting food on the table, I matter. If you don't, people who do not have paid employment, for whatever reason, are immediately suspect. And because we only dignify people who can claim to have a job, we tend to rebrand activities like parenting or school as work. So students, you have probably been told or you've thought yourself that school is like your job. I think that is a way of telling ourselves, telling our families, telling our neighbors, and so on, that we matter. We are contributing to society. We're not, just because we're students doesn't mean we're lesser. So we talk about school as work. We talk about parenting as work. We talk about marriage as work. We talk about mental health as work. All of these things, if they aren't work, well, what value do they have? This is the mindset that we have. Second, work hard and you get moral character. The idea here is that working forms you morally and always for the better. This is something we often tell teenagers. We believe that they will stop being lazy and become industrious. They will develop grit if only they get a job babysitting or cutting lawns or something like that. Third, the promise of the work ethic is that it gives you spiritual purpose. It gives you meaning. You'll contribute to higher goods, not just in society, but in God's creation or kingdom. This is where language like vocation comes in. So we have pretty high expectations for work, according to our current societal mythology. But actual jobs do not reliably fulfill this very lofty promise. Yes, you gain social recognition through paid employment, but you lose dignity in other ways, other senses of dignity. So in many jobs, you may, gain that social recognition as a employee and a contributor to society and all that, but you give up autonomy. You give up your right to privacy. In some cases, you give up your right to go to the bathroom during work hours. Additionally, work doesn't only form character, but it also can deform character. And the simple reason is that work inculcates habits through repeated action. We are what we repeatedly do. And the question is, are those habits good or bad? Sure, grit, perseverance, things like that, those are good. That's a good virtue to build up through habits learned at work. What about, though, the vices of impatience? What about indifference to others? What about the vice of building up technical skill at the cost of human empathy? Those vices could be encouraged by a job every bit as much as the virtues of grit, perseverance, industriousness, and so on are. Third, often there is a lack of purpose or lack of obvious purpose. Jobs, things like burnout, precarious employment, fluid employment, and meaninglessness in work render work's purpose questionable. Oftentimes at work, we don't spend time doing what we thought we would. Think of physicians who spend hours a day on data entry with their electronic health records. Physicians have a high burnout rate accordingly. Our work is often abstract. We imagine the paradigmatic worker as someone who produces a thing that they can then admire and sell and so on. But our actual product is some things like user experience or shareholder value. These are harder to grab hold of and point to and feel good about, rendering the purpose questionable. So it's somewhat ironic that the pursuit of purpose through hard work can undermine your attainment of purpose. Now, to be sure, work is not this bad for everyone. Many of you may feel very fulfilled by your work, but I think that the promise is empty enough for enough people that we can't in good faith keep making this extremely lofty promise about work. Because it's leading to this burnout culture. So getting beyond burnout culture is going to mean closing that gap between ideals and reality, our ideals for work and the reality of our jobs. And we'll have to do that from both sides. It may involve lowering ideals while improving the reality. And I want to say that if there's a thesis to this talk, it's that the Catholic intellectual and spiritual tradition has fantastic resources that can help. And, I think that a big part, the work ethic that's kind of the problem is sometimes called the Protestant work ethic. I'm in no way trying to say that Protestantism caused this problem and Catholicism is going to fix it. In fact, the Catholic tradition has very often been complicit in promoting this very false promise. You can think about complaining about your job or something and someone says, well, offer it up to the souls in purgatory. That's a way of kind of, the Catholic tradition has these resources to kind of contribute to the to this gap too. But at its best, the Catholic tradition offers an alternative. On the social level, in the Catholic tradition, human dignity does not depend on work. On the moral level, each worker is entitled to compassion. And on the spiritual level, we find our highest purpose not in work, but in leisure. So let me break this down. So, dignity. The idea in the Catholic tradition is that all people have inherent worth before they ever go to work, and if they never go to work. You can never earn more dignity than you already have by virtue of being a human being made in the image and likeness of God. That is the foundation of our dignity. You can't get better than that. Through hard work. In addition, you can look in, there's a lot in Genesis on this. There's the creation of human beings in Genesis 1, but also in Genesis 2. The first human being is created before there's any work to do. God creates the man and only later decides, I should give this guy a job. So human beings, you'll sometimes hear theologians argue human beings were made, to work. I don't think that's true. Human beings are created, according to Genesis, prior to there being any work to do. Additionally, in the New Testament, Matthew 6, the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, they don't work, but God provides for them. And as Jesus reminds the disciples, human beings have more dignity than the birds and the lilies. So how much more honor do we get, even without working? And one articulation, a very important articulation of this, comes from St. John Paul II's 1981 encyclical Laborem Exercens. He makes this philosophical distinction between the subjective and objective dimensions of work. And he says that dignity is in the subjective dimension. What this means is that the objective character of our work, what we actually do at work, what our working conditions are, ought to measure up to the inherent dignity of the person who is working and not the other way around. So in this very lovely quote, the basis for determining the value of human work is the fact that the one who is doing it is a person. That's what makes work meaningful. Work doesn't dignify us, we dignify work because we have inherent dignity. This leads directly into the second principle of compassion. If dignity pays attention to the universal characteristics of the worker as a human being, then compassion pays attention to the specific needs of the individual and makes sure those needs are met. so the worker can do the best they're capable of in the most humane conditions. And here I want to turn to 1891, 90 years before John Paul's encyclical, to Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, which is largely about work. Leo says, daily labor should be so regulated as not to be protracted over longer hours than strength admits. How many and how long the intervals of rest should be must depend on the nature of the work, on the circumstances of time and place, and on the health and strength of the worker. And he mentions that miners should have shorter hours because their work is so difficult. In other words, working conditions, in particular schedules, ought to be relative to and fitted to the capacities of the one who is doing them. There is no one-size-fits-all work week. It depends, Leo was saying, on the time of year. Is it the middle of summer in Texas? Is it, on the kind of work being done? Is it coal mining? Is it some other extremely physically difficult work? We might apply what he says here about miners today to nurses who work long hours on their feet in stressful conditions, or to food pickers or warehouse pickers who work long hours in often hot conditions, without water or bathroom breaks. So that, I think, is compassion for those workers. What does this worker need? The third point is that we find our highest purpose not in work, but in leisure. And here, I want to turn to the German Catholic philosopher Joseph Pieper and his delightful little book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. Pieper was writing in the wreckage of World War II European society, and he saw it as a society of what he called total work, in which work defines the human being. But this is a distortion. We don't live primarily for work, according to Pieper, but for leisure, which activates our whole being in a way that work does not. So a quote or two from Pieper. And leisure, for him, leisure is like philosophy and like artistic contemplation and stuff like that. It's not Instagram. That's my leisure, but he has a higher conception of it. But he says the power to know leisure is the power to overstep the boundaries of the workaday world and reach out to superhuman, life-giving existential forces that refresh and renew us before we turn back to our daily work. Only in genuine leisure does a gateway to freedom open. So he like I said, for him, leisure is about contemplation primarily. It's a passive endeavor. It's about receptivity to goodness and truth, not the kind of arduous search for these things. Pieper also sees leisure in festivity. He says the soul of leisure lies in celebration. And furthermore, he says if celebration is the core of leisure, then leisure can only be made possible and justifiable on the same basis as the celebration of a festival. So, Pieper, I don't know what he knew about like Carnival and Mardi Gras, but that's what he's talking about. That's what he means by celebration. Because he says the same basis of the celebration of a festival, that basis is divine worship. Like Carnival is connected to the Feast of Easter. And for Pieper, that's important because, he claims that the highest form of divine worship, of course, is the Eucharist. So to him, the Eucharist, it anticipates the heavenly banquet. What is a banquet? It's a party. It's fun. It's leisure. So like our festivity here on earth is also, connected to the heavenly banquet. So together, I think that these three pillars of universal dignity, compassion for the individual worker, and the meaning of life found in leisure, I think they shift the stakes of work in a way that can help close the gap between the promise and the reality of work. The principle of universal human dignity means employers ought to offer conditions that are commensurate with that dignity. The principle of compassion means that each worker deserves conditions that accommodate their specific needs. And the principle of leisure means that work is not the end-all and be-all of our existence. It lowers the stakes of work. So we're closing that gap from both the top and bottom. All right, so that's all the theoretical side of what I think the Catholic tradition has to offer to help us combat burnout culture. But the Catholic tradition also has a practical, there's a practical side to it that can help as well. And to see what a Catholic alternative to burnout culture looks like in practice, I want to look specifically at communities of Benedictine religious to find models of keeping work within humane limits so that it doesn't overtake spiritual life. The Benedictine motto is ora et labora, prayer and work. It sounds like the Benedictines are saying there should be an equal balance. Why are we here? We're to pray and we're here to work. In fact, though, different Benedictine communities balance prayer and work quite differently. And surprisingly, in many cases, the balance is tipped in favor of prayer rather than work. Benedictines often put serious boundaries on work. And, what I wonder is, how can we who live in what Benedictines, particularly contemplative ones, just call the world, how can we learn from them? So to find out, I went here. This is the Monastery of Christ in the Desert in northern New Mexico, one of the most beautiful places I have ever been. I went there for several days a few years ago, and I've also interviewed monks and sisters at 2 monasteries in Minnesota that are kind of more active communities. Benedictine religious are modern people living by a pre-modern rule. So the rule of St. Benedict, the kind of handbook for how to be a Benedictine, was written in 530. And what I find appealing about it, and what I find appealing about ways of life that are built around the rule, is that it doesn't have any of our kind of modern industrial age baggage. And this community at Christ in the Desert tries to interpret the rule pretty rigorously. So, if you visit there, you'll see monks walk, especially junior monks, walking around with the rule in hand, like, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do now? Well, what does Benedict say? And what I have found is that the monks at Christ in the Desert take several measures to limit their identification with work. They have to work in some way or other to sustain their community. They live pretty far off the grid. 13 miles down a dirt road. They generate their own electricity. They pump their own water. But nevertheless, they manage to keep their work in check so that they can pursue their spiritual goals. And the most obvious way that they limit their work is through their schedule, which is built around 7 periods of communal prayer, plus Mass and time for private prayer. In all, members of this community in New Mexico are spending at least 5 hours a day in prayer. And here they are at one of their offices of prayer in their chapel. And the first of those offices is at 4 a.m. So the first bell rings at, I think, about 3:30 in the morning. Of course, it's still dark, it's quite cold, but they're there. And they pray, they have Mass, they eat breakfast, and then their work period begins at 9 o'clock and lasts until about 12:30. Then they have prayer, followed by their main meal of the day, in the afternoon, which is eaten communally. And then they have, other activities, more prayer, and they're in bed at, 8 or 9. And I asked one of the monks who had been a defense attorney. So this is someone who's well acquainted with the secular work ethic. What happens? What do you do when you're working all morning and you're in the middle of something and you hear the chapel bell ring and you've got 5 minutes to make it to the chapel? What do you do when your work feels undone? And he said, you get over it. Which struck me, getting over it struck me as a very important spiritual discipline. And it's one that it's a discipline's made possible by the monastic schedule and the bells and all of that. And like if you're late for chapel, there's supposed to be punishment, and it's just like you kneel in the middle for like a few seconds before your superiors say it's okay to stand. But you're expected to be there. And Benedict says that nothing is to be preferred to what he calls the work of God. And what he means by the work of God there is this communal prayer. In addition to the schedule, there are a few other habits and practices in this Benedictine community and others that keep work in check. So another is the rotation of duties from week to week. His woodworking shop. But yeah, Benedict says that the brothers and sisters should serve each other, and they should serve the guests, and no one should be a permanent server or a permanent cook or a permanent dishwasher. They rotate these duties. And I think what that does is it keeps you from identifying with that one task. I went to the monastery. What kind of stuff did you? I washed dishes for 50 years. It's not like that. And so if it's, Brother Leo's turn to cook and he's a terrible cook, that's another thing you get over. Say, well, we all have to do our part in this community. And Leo's not a great cook, but so be it. That doesn't define him. That's not who he is. He's not going to be cooking next week. He's going to be doing something else. The idea here is that, work is not meant to be this path to individual fulfillment, but it needs to serve communal needs. Another example of this is the requirement that laborers in the monastery, artisans, work with humility. If there are skilled artisans in the monastery, that's great. They have an opportunity to help the monastery make a lot of money. If they believe that they are making the monastery a lot of money and that they're the ones who make the monastery function, they're to be removed from that work. Because something is more important. Humility is more important than productivity. The community is more important than profits. The community is more important than an individual feeling that he or she is a great artisan. This is the exact opposite of how we do things in the secular economy. If someone is great at something, you have them do it as much as possible so that they can become skilled and find a niche and make a lot of money at it. Be very productive. But it doesn't work in a monastic community. Very quickly, this is not an example of the humility principle, but this Monastery of Christ in the Desert back in the 90s, they were trying to figure out, well, how are we going to make money in the middle of the desert? We can't like have clients come up and do things, because it's so far away. But they decided that they were going to do web design. They thought of themselves as scribes, basically. They thought this is something that we can do from our remote location. They got a lot of press coverage. They started to get a lot of orders. And just when things were starting to take off, they quit. And the reason that the abbot told me is that the web design work was getting in the way of their prayer. It took too long to do this work. It was so intensive that they couldn't do it 3 hours a day and do it well. It took long to train the monk. So a monk would get trained on web design, and then, it's time for him to, to study for ordination, and we can't actually put him to work. So that, we'll make money some other way. This isn't going to work for us. It's insane, according to ordinary worldly principles, but not within the walls of a monastery. So yeah, what I see, and what I see is such a great example here, is that these monks have detached dignity, character, and purpose from work. Work matters to them, but the community is where they find those goods. That's where they find dignity, character, and purpose. And I think that they show how people who are not monks might be able to integrate work into our lives in a more spiritually healthy way. So I want to conclude by mentioning one final principle from Catholic social teaching that's an indispensable tool for dismantling burnout culture and building something more humane, and it's solidarity. To beat burnout, we have to demand less of each other in our communities. Burnout is caused partly by our extremely high demands of ourselves and others. This means our workplaces need to say no to many calls to do more and more, to expand their missions and their revenue streams. But it also means saying yes. It means saying yes to more empathy, more respect, more justice, and more compassion. And what the principle of solidarity, I think, reveals to us is that my actions affect your burnout and vice versa. The question can't only be, how can I prevent my burnout? It has to be, how can I prevent yours? Thank you very much. We'll do some questions.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions. The presidential ambassadors will bring, if you raise your hand, they'll bring the microphone to you and hold you. And we'll have just a little bit of brief time for some questions and answers. Sure. And then we'll sort of wrap it up. So if you have a question or a brief comment, raise your hand, and the ambassadors are in the back, then we'll bring them to you.
Hi there. I'm Javier Montesel from the Theology Department here at St. Mary's. I wonder, Dr. Malesic, what you would make of the right to productive work in the Catholic social tradition, which is rooted in this vision of work rightly understood as necessary, not a kind of concession, but as necessary to what it means to be fully human in the world. Work envisioned as a kind of participation in God's own creative making. It's the right to productive work. Human beings have to make things that are worth something even in the worldly economy. How does that fit into the sort of overall argument that you're presenting today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in a couple of ways. I mean, I think of one, I'm not going to back up to the slide. What am I doing? But I think that it says something about that sense of, effectiveness or something, right? One contributor to burnout is the feeling of ineffectiveness, that your work isn't accomplishing something. And that could be because, you could be wrong about that. Like, you could feel it's ineffective, but actually it's a bit more effective. But you really could be, you may perhaps not be asked to do something truly productive. And I think that's, that may be what Leo, how we can connect that idea to this idea of burnout. That, that you deserve to see what the fruits of your labor are. And, that becomes a challenge when your work is more abstract, as so much of ours is in our economy. And I think it's also connected to raising the floor on things like, work is necessary, and so therefore Leo argues for a living wage, and things like that.
Hi, James Greenaway from the philosophy department. Just wondered, did you have any thoughts on the Catholic University and what the Catholic University could do in terms of more leisure, contributing to thinking about, yes, work, yes, success, but also a meaningful life through leisure?
Yeah, well, and I think that this ties in so well, to what the Center for Catholic Studies is doing in trying to understand what the Catholic University does for students, how it forms them not only as workers, but as, people of, moral character and a commitment to service and so on. That maybe this is another, survey question that you need is like, do graduates of Catholic universities have more fun? Not just like in college, but 20, 30, 40 years down the road. But yeah, I mean, I think like, there's, oh shoot, I can't think of what college is. I want to say it's something like Williams College. There's like one day, I think, like in spring or fall, and the president declares like, all right, there's going to be, I can't remember what they call it, but like all classes are canceled, but you're going to meet and have conversations and like book discussions and go on hikes with your faculty and things like this. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I think, Catholic universities could stand to do more of. I've heard about this oyster bake. It sounds great. Every university should probably have something like that. But yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of ways. There could be, kind of like I say, like canceling a day of class, but it's like no, this isn't a day to like, just it's not a day off. It's a day for leisure. And the activities are you're not going to be in class, but you're going, there's going to be more contemplative kind of activities, but also fun, I mean, there could be like greater integration with the liturgical year, could be, part of that as well. I don't know, this is kind of just off the top of my head.
Thanks very much for your presentation. I'm guessing as you join friends around the table, they often invite you to, all right, walk us through this again, as they themselves are navigating their own work experiences. I guess the question that I wanted to pose is, as you present this to different audiences, are you seeing different reactions based on age, generation?
I don't know. I know that when I talk to students, they invariably feel under tremendous pressure, to work hard in school, often work for pay outside of school. Much of that pressure comes from family, but it's not just from family. I mean, it's cultural. But yeah, I mean, people my age and older are, like, boy, whew, man, I wish, that sounds great. But still feel like they can't quite, live a more leisured existence. And I mean, I struggle with it tremendously. Like, I don't know. I mean, I care a lot about my work, and I struggle quite a bit, with leisure. So, it's a battle still for me too. I mean, there's just so much cultural learning to unlearn. It's that spiritual discipline of getting over it is a really hard one. I think so. No, I mean, you're absolutely right, that, yeah, like labor, like toil in the, like, Genesis 3 sense, that's the punishment, that's the consequence of being kicked out of Eden. Right, the expectation is, by the sweat of your brow, you shall eat bread until you return to the earth, basically, and it's going to be difficult. And it gets even harder for, the next generation. Like, the earth will not even yield to you. But at the same time, the New Testament, there's so much in the New Testament that says, no, you should expect, my burden is light, is what Jesus says. Like, there's so much, I think, that shows that, the gospel is a promise of a less toilsome existence. So I think that's where the expectation, kind of rightly comes from. There's, right, is the feeling of being forsaken, certainly. I don't know if I'd call that burnout, but, yeah, certainly there's a kind of, exhaustion or something like that. But, I don't know, I haven't thought about that. My instinct is to say that's not burnout, but I haven't thought about it.
One last question.
So practically speaking, for those of us who are in professions where we're being told to do this faster, do it better, do it more efficiently, and by the way, if you have some time, go make that bed in room 4 and make the coffee, and practical point, like 1 or 2 action points that we may be able to work on to try to change our workplace and the culture that we're working in.
Yeah, I think it has. My answer may be disappointing, but but I think you're right to ask, like, what can we do, from an organizational perspective, a managerial perspective. The answer is not, we're not going to solve this problem on the individual level. Like, it's not you draw sharper boundaries. In some cases, there's no other option, and that's the only way to kind of preserve yourself, or like, to quit or something like that, in extreme cases. But yeah, it's gotta, the solution is going to happen at the organizational level and particularly at the cultural level. And I think, like, so here's the disappointing part, is, like, I think that, my last point about solidarity is about changing expectations of not only the workers, but the people whose work is being served. So, like, all of us are, in addition to, workers or future workers, every single one of us is a customer, a client, a patient, a passenger, etc., a student. What demands are we placing on the workers that we encounter every day? Because we encounter dozens, if not hundreds, a day. I think this is a tough message, I think, particularly with healthcare, because you don't want to tell someone, like, just don't worry about it, right? But, patients I know myself as a patient. I demand a lot of, of my clinicians. I probably, I may demand, a bit too much, as a customer. How are we treating those, who we're interacting with there, and so on. As a, I don't know, as like, someone on a managerial level, like are we churning people through like, meeting after meeting or something like that? Are we changing protocols over and over and over again, and people have to adapt? So I think it's got to be that, broad-based thing where we recognize ourselves in connection with each other on multiple levels and in multiple directions. I wish I had a more concrete answer. I don't even have a more concrete answer necessarily in my book, which is, but it is available. It's actually available right outside. But if you don't want to purchase it there, you can at the press website, and that's how to get in touch with me.